campaigning for Scottish independence. So over to you, Pete.
Thanks very much. Well, listen, thanks very much for having me. First of all, it's really great to be here doing a meeting like this in London. Hopefully, the first of many. I'm sure that will be happening south of the border. So tonight, I wanted to talk to you briefly about three themes in relation to the Scottish independence referendum. I want to talk to you a little bit about nationalism. I want to talk to you about the class dynamics of the referendum, and also I want to briefly talk about what I think some of the contributing factors leading to a rise in support for independence. I want to briefly talk about what those factors I think are. So, on the first point, well, often in politics I like to recall that old Marx Brothers joke. He looks like an idiot, he acts like an idiot, but please don't be confused, he really is an idiot. Now, I like to apply that logic to Ed Miliband, not incidentally because I think he's an idiot. I don't mean to slander the leader of the opposition right now, but no. What I mean is that Ed Miliband acts like a nationalist, he looks like a nationalist, but don't let that mislead you, he really is a nationalist. But don't take my word for it on this. I want to briefly quote to you an excerpt from a recent speech by Ed Miliband, apparently on the economy. And he said, "I want to tell you what the next election is about for Labour. We're Britain and we should never settle for second best. Britain should be doing a lot better. We are Britain and we can do better than this. Britain can do better than this. I'm also optimistic about Britain and its future, and I say Britain can do better than this." And to paraphrase John Lennon, he's not the only one. Here's Gordon Brown on a recent trip to Tanzania. "We should be proud of our colonial history in Africa. The days of Britain having to apologise for its colonial history are over." And not to leave him out, finally I'd like to briefly quote Tony Blair. This is what he had to say. "Century upon century it has been the destiny of Britain to lead other nations. That should not be a destiny that is part of our history. It should be part of our future." Now, why do I quote these three quotes, as it were? And the reason is that when I'm in Scotland, it's funny because I speak to a lot of very educated people, you know, professors and journalists and doctors and the like, who say, "I can't support Scottish independence because I don't like nationalism. I'm not a nationalist and I'm horrified, terrified by the prospect of nationalism." But this isn't a fringe issue or a fringe opinion. Labour are continuously, at the moment, attempting to peddle the line that this is a battle between nationalism and something else, perhaps internationalism. They generally don't quite say. So, for example, on a recent trip north, Ed Miliband was very clear to warn against the dangers of narrow nationalism, as he called it. And on Newsnight a few days ago, a Labour spin doctor compared the Yes movement to the Tea Party, to UKIP, and even in the same interview to the Front National. And to be honest, that's actually nothing compared to some of the treatment Alex Salmond's coming for. Not that I'm a particular fan of Alex Salmond, but over the course of the last couple of years, Labour politicians and officials have referred to Alex Salmond variously as Mugabe, Hitler, Mussolini, and even Caligula and Nero. You need to have a degree in the classics to understand quite what they're saying about him. But effectively we have this endless tirade at Labour conferences that, you know, there is this narrow nationalism, etc., etc. And often you have the Scottish media who sit and nod along and say, yes, this really is a fair reflection of reality, and buy into it. And by contrast, I would say that there's undue deference to the political wisdom of London think tanks, plus Treasury officials presented as detached academic figures to be trusted. Now, these aren't my words, actually. They are the words of a recent scholarly report compiled on BBC bias in the referendum campaign, incidentally compiled by a no-voting academic as well. So, fundamentally, that's why myself and James Foley started writing the book, Yes, the Radical Case for Scottish Independence. We didn't want to focus on the narrow question of Scotland. How many powers should Scotland have? How many powers does it deserve? Or even if it's been spoilt rotten or bullied on the other hand. For us, the core issue of the referendum is Britain. But ultimately in in the course of the debate so far, this truth has largely remained hidden because British officials are treated as dispassionate authority figures. And British nationalism is generally seen as something that UKIP or the BNP do, not the mainstream parties at Westminster. Now, unless we try and correct that, we'll always look at the referendum through a distorted lens, and so you sort of get two things happening if you do that. Firstly, you see the SNP as delusional or romantic fantasists. Now, I don't think that's the case, by the way, but that's not actually necessarily that important. To me, the real problem is the assumption that slips by, which is that Britain's leaders, by contrast, are somehow in touch with reality, that they're pragmatic and merely looking out for the common interest, not the narrow sectional interest. And secondly, the result is that the media generally portray a narrative which is that all the risks in a referendum are on the yes side. There are apparently no risks whatsoever for Scotland of staying part of the UK. So our aim when we were writing this book was to attempt to spin this on its head. And so we've argued, for example, that official Westminster is not dispassionate. It's saturated by dark dreams and fantasies. And it's often said that nationalism begins with a convenient forgetting of your own history, and that's why at the start I wanted to quote Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Because there's a thread that runs through those passages. Britain has a special role, special rights, special duties. Britain's not just a nation, it's a special nation. And this notion cuts across all of the Westminster parties. And to me, this is the truly dangerous ideology at play in the referendum. And this starts in recent decades, for example, with forgetting of the past, so the forgetting of the massacres, famines and economic damage caused by the British Empire. Britain, we hear, was not great just because it was powerful, but because it was the apostate of civilization. It laboured under Kipling's white man's burden to spread what David Livingstone called commerce, Christianity and civilization. And today it continues as a junior partner in American global ambitions with the same aim, ultimately spreading free markets by the gunboat. And I think that many of Westminster's leaders think that Britain's destiny is continuing in that junior role. And so, for once, I actually agree with David Willet's MP, because when pressed on it, he was asked to sum up what he thought the underlying meaning of Britain was. And this is what he said: Great Britain provides the political institutions which link the English and Scottish nations in, above all, an outward-looking endeavour of trade and conquest. It is the British Army, the British Empire and the British Pound. So I want to ask the question, when talking about nationalism, which is truly more dangerous, a counter-state, separatist nationalism, or an ingrained imperial nationalism, the nationalism of Britain? And in my opinion, we need to understand the referendum in this context. This isn't a vote on national identity, it's a vote on the potential breakup of an old, largely archaic, reactionary state and the potential establishment of a new state. And the knock-on effects would be quite fundamental. The result of a yes vote, for example, would mean the unilateral disarmament of Trident nuclear weapons, which would have severe knock-on effects. For example, the United Kingdom would quite possibly lose its seat on the Permanent Council of the UN Security Council. So it would be really quite significant. And so the way I like to think about it is this. Every few years, we get the opportunity to vote for our political representatives. How often do we get the chance to vote on the fate of a global superpower? And that's what's at stake in this referendum ultimately, and that's why, in my opinion, it's so important that people outside of Scotland take this question very seriously and really start to debate the ramifications of it. So what is the driving process in the referendum, if it's not, for example, identity and so on? Well, one of the arguments that we made in our book is that fundamentally the referendum is about class. And what do I mean by that? Well, incidentally, when we wrote the book, we felt that this was quite a controversial argument. Recently, actually, it seems that we've largely won it in the debate. And basically, the trend is quite clear. The poorer you are, the poorer the area you live in, the more likely you are to support Scottish independence. And conversely, the richer you are, the higher income bracket you're in, the nicer the area you live in, the more likely you are to support a no vote. And that's backed up by various sets of polling, from the Scottish Social Attitude Survey, from various pollsters like YouGov and so on. And it's not just the Scottish press like the Herald and the Scotsman that are making this argument, and radicals like us. It's also been written about in the Financial Times, in The Economist, in The Guardian, and in fact, Washington Post columnist last week went so far as to say that poverty and class would be the fundamental deciding factors in what happens in the referendum. And it's not the case this class dynamic at play is just static. What do I mean by that? Well, for example, I'm sure many of you probably heard about the latest Scotland on Sunday ICM poll. It came out about a week ago, and it showed the closest stats, the closest narrowing of the poll so far, if you like. Actually, it shouldn't have been the latest one. In fact, YouGov were doing a poll yesterday. The results were supposed to be published yesterday. The one thing is that it was Better Together that commissioned the poll, and they refused to publish the results. So you can make of that what you will, but I assume it wasn't necessarily that good for them. But anyway, so the last poll for ICM, once don't knows are discounted, 52% no, 48% yes. So it really is very close at this stage. And the general sort of media narrative was everyone in Scotland moving towards yes. Yes campaigns winning now. Well, that's true on one level, but actually let's drill down into the figures a little bit. Because it's not as simple as to say that everyone in Scotland suddenly more in favour of independence. Actually, if you look at it, if you look at the data from that singular poll, actually those in the top income brackets, the A, B and C income brackets, support for independence actually fell by 4 points since its previous poll. So the massive swell in support for Scottish independence is all coming from the Scottish working classes, from those in the lowest income brackets and so on. And I think this is very important, because when we're seeing this general narrative of more and more support for Scottish independence, this is primarily coming from those disenfranchised people in Scotland. That is how the debate is progressing at the moment. And perhaps this shouldn't surprise us, because the Scottish working class has always held more radical constitutional preferences. So, for example, in the 1979 devolution referendum, 57% of working class Scots supported devolution, 60% of middle class voters opposed it. And even in 1997, when all classes ultimately supported the establishment of a Scottish Parliament, support was far higher amongst the working class. So 91% backed the establishment of a Scottish Parliament compared to only 69% in the middle classes. Now, why is this important? Well, to me it's important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, and one of the important reasons, is that there's a general narrative amongst sociologists, the media and so on, which is that the Scottish Parliament was established because various professionals and the middle classes came together with various civil society institutions, and that was what won the campaign for a Scottish Parliament. Now, a small part of that's true, but it's only a very small part, because actually those groups were behind working class opinion in Scotland. And that's important for two reasons. One, because you hear a couple of things about the referendum. One is that you hear that Scottish nationalism is entirely a middle class phenomenon. And I think from that data you can clearly see it's not. The other thing that people say is that all that matters is winning the Scottish middle class to support for independence. And that's all you really have to do to win. And again, I think this shows that that's not the case. And it's also important because we have to ask the question, what's driving the shift in the polls? And fundamentally, I think it's about three things. And obviously it's a very complex question, but the drivers are the questions of austerity, inequality, poverty, and so on. And the two campaigns, yes and no, are now fundamentally polarising between right and left. It's often a little bit messy. You do get different people ending up on both sides, but really when you get down to it, it really is a left-wing campaign versus a right-wing campaign. And so ultimately yes voters aren't deluded but with nationalism. And I've done meetings now across Scotland, and it's always the same themes that come up. It's not tartan pride or blood and shortbread, it's people sick of politicians making a farce of democracy by grovelling before inherited wealth and private power. It's people unwilling to tolerate winners and losers, people who ultimately can't remain loyal to Westminster with its centre ground of Iraq invaders, trident deployers and bedroom taxes. It's people who want to hear alternatives, and that is what they are beginning to hear, because the referendums also had another effect. because it's re-energised political engagement north of the border to a massive degree. Across Scotland, in every city and every town, people are beginning to ask a question, which is, what sort of society do we want to live in? So, for example, tonight, as we're all sitting here, I know of 7 meetings going on in different towns in Scotland. The only reason I know that there's 7 going on at the moment is because I know the people speaking at them. There's quite possibly more. And it's not just tonight that that's happening, by the way. That's every single night. Meetings are happening all over the place. Places that, quite frankly, I've never heard of, let alone been to, that, you know, you're actually getting people re-engaging with the political process again. And, you know, we've tried it a couple of times, count how many meetings have gone on in a week in Scotland, and you just lose count. It's quite amazing. The thing is, though, that most of these new groups aren't being set up by the SNP, or SNP members, or SNP supporters. And the reason I know that is because often when they get set up, they contact the Radical Independence campaign and say, we support independence, we want to do something, we don't particularly like the SNP, can you send us some leaflets? Because we don't want to use the official ones. So this is happening all the time, and as I say, it's not just the SNP. And the thing that's happened, though, with the constitutional process is that it has forced into people's heads, all these people's heads who are organising for the first time sometimes, but it's forced 2 questions into their head. 1, what sort of society do we currently live in? And 2, what sort of society do we want to live in? With the obvious add-on, which is, how could you possibly get there? Now, part of the answer to that question, in my opinion, is yes, but that's not the only part of it. And obviously the vote in September is not a vote for socialism or anything like that, and no one on the left in Scotland is stupid enough to think that. But it has created an opening, and the left has seized it. We launched the Radical Independence campaign, and it's been incredibly successful. Works with the official Yes campaign, but also organises separately to it as well. And we've now pretty much organised what seems to be one of the biggest grassroots radical movements in Scotland in recent decades. And it really has transformed the left, and it has united the left in the sense that it involves socialists, environmentalists, anti-war activists, community campaigners, and trade unionists. So we've united the majority of the left behind this. But it's also brought in a massive new layer of activists for the first time. That's what's so important. But just to finish, we do need all of you as well, because it's not just an issue for Scotland. As I tried to address, this is an issue that's going to have ramifications for everyone in the UK. And obviously I hope that you support independence. But even if you don't, either way, I want you to get involved in the debate, and we want you to get involved in the debate. But particularly, I'll say, if you supported Scottish independence, I particularly want you to get involved in the debate. And the reason is this. We constantly have Z-list celebrities coming up to Scotland now, telling us why we should all oppose Scottish independence. Generally, it's the likes of Jonathan Ross or someone like that. And I'll be honest, it's a bit of a pain, right? And not that I'm saying that everyone's suddenly listening to Jonathan Ross, by the way. It doesn't necessarily have its desired effects. But you can't underestimate how much it means to a lot of people in Scotland when they hear English people coming out and saying that they support Scottish independence. It gives people a massive confidence. It really does. So, for example, when people heard that Billy Bragg came out and support Scottish independence, it made a difference. And I don't just mean we want celebrities to endorse it and so on. Everything you can do to add your voices to debate would be most welcomed by so many people north of the border. And finally, I will extend one invitation. There's a lot of Labour students coming up to campaign against Scottish independence at the moment. So I did issue an invitation to all of you. You're all welcome over the next few months, particularly in and around summer and September. Come up to Scotland, get involved, and you can nail on the head, once and for all, any idea that this has anything to do with anti-English sentiment or anything like that. And that's why it's so important to us. So genuinely, book a week off work and come up to Scotland. We'll host you. So thank you very much. Quite a few questions there. Just quickly, I'll start on the question of racism, because I think you're absolutely right to bring it up, and it is an issue, because you've got some very strange arguments on both sides around the question of racism. On the one hand, you do have a lot of left nationalist types saying, that's not really a problem here, you know? Scotland is fine, we're free of that sort of thing. And when you say, actually that's not the case, they kind of want to stick their fingers in their ears and say, no, it's fine. And, you know, if you really press them on it, they'll sort of say, well, let's get independence first and then we'll start dealing with it afterwards. And that's something I think we have to combat. The other thing is that around the racism, I think there's been a really interesting sort of thing that's happened in the media. because I don't know if you've heard this down here at all. They're constantly trying to play up the question of anti-English racism as a direct result of the referendum. So, for example, this is one thing we wrote about a little bit in our book. So, for example, last year, the Scottish Government produces its data on racially motivated violent attacks and so on. And it shows that white-on-white attacks went up a few percent. The media immediately latched onto it, with the sort of headlines of referendum stoking anti-English violence, the SNP has to do something about it, all the sort of things you'd expect. The Tories couldn't wait to get their press releases out condemning it and so on. So it forced the Scottish Government to release slightly more detailed figures, which showed that actually attacks on English people in Scotland had fallen. Their classification of white on white, which incidentally is a slightly dodgy classification anyway, but actually the majority of attacks were on people of Irish descent. After that it was Poles, and so on and so on. And that was tiny, by the way, in comparison to the number of attacks on Pakistani Muslims, who, surprise, surprise, were still the biggest number of people who got attacked in Scotland. I think out of a total of 1,700 attacks, only 70 were against English people. Now look, any sort of discrimination is obviously bad, but why is it that the media report the question of anti-English racism above, say, the topic of attacks on Muslims and so on, or anyone like that? Why is it that this is a sort of, dare I say it, sexy topic for the media? Now, to me the question is, how should we look at this? Because obviously the media are looking at it through the frame of the referendum and so on. They are looking at the referendum, and of course that means that you look for racism and so on in Scottish identity. Now, I'm not saying Scottish identity is good somehow, in some sort of definite way, but actually, if you look at the total number of racist attacks in Scotland, on Pakistani Muslims, on the people of Irish descent, on Polish people and so on, well, perhaps you start to look at a different identity which is the source of this, which is the British identity, the imperial legacy, the legacy of empire, and so on and so on. And people occasionally tell me that anti-Irish racism doesn't exist in Scotland anymore because you have, in 1990, officially employment parity and so on, incidentally 100 years after they achieved it in the US. But I don't think you can say that the ideology of persecution against the Irish community can suddenly disappear just like that. There's a legacy of it and so on, and it comes back to Scotland's connection to the question of empire and so on. So I absolutely agree. Racism is an issue in Scotland, and I think we have to challenge the mainstream narratives on it, and quite frankly I think we should make it a part of the debate. We need to say, well, actually, if we want to use a referendum as a way to tackle a whole series of issues, we need to be able to use it to take on the question of racism as well. There's quite a few questions about after September the 18th, what happens afterwards, and obviously that's a really big and difficult question, and you have to create quite a few different scenarios and so on. But I'll try and go through it loosely. I mean, for example, what do I think would happen, loosely speaking, in the event of a yes and a no vote? Well, in the event of a no vote, what is probably going to happen is, well, I would say that a lot of people are going to be pretty upset, obviously. But okay, what happens in political terms? Well, the Labour Party aren't going to win in 2016. It really doesn't look like that. They're not going to make a comeback. They have a quite incompetent front bench team, as it were. Most of their leading lights, which are, pretty thin on the ground at the best times, they either moved to politics at a UK level, or they lost their seats in the last election, for various reasons I won't go into just now. But for example, it's crazy that you've got at the moment, after, in the second term of an SNP government, the SNP are massively ahead of Labour in the polls, and quite frankly, Lamont is not going to be able to challenge Salmond, Sturgeon and so on. One of the reasons the SNP did win a majority last time, as well as a host of political ones, is that they were good state administrators, effectively. There were a lot more competent administrators than anyone in Scottish Labour, and that's going to continue to play. So in the event of a no vote, it is very likely that the SNP will probably win the next election, probably on the caveat they'll be probably forced into saying that if they win again they won't have another referendum, or something like that. But that is one thing that will probably happen. There'll be some sort of debate about should more powers be devolved and so on. That's a big question that's quite difficult to go into. I can't see, for example, the problem is that the political elite and so on are quite split on the matter. Some of the Tories, for example, say that they would want to see some sort of devolution matter. The reason being that, make Scotland look after its own affairs, force them to actually make the hard cuts that need to be made and so on and so on, make them fiscally responsible rather than rely on this bloated welfare state and all the rest of it. That would be a fight that would have to be had. But to be honest, the left would not do well in the event of a no vote, in all honesty, because the reason being that you build up a massive degree of momentum through a campaign, and if you lose, you can't help it gets sucked out, if you know what I mean. So what we do afterwards, that is a much bigger question, and that is a difficult one to answer. Obviously, the Radical Independence campaign will continue to function on some level. I'm not going to sit here and pretend, though, that it's going to be even bigger in the event of a no vote. I don't think that's going to happen, so that's something we're going to have to get used to. In the event of a yes vote, though, you've got to ask yourselves a series of questions, because the interesting thing about Scottish politics is because the Conservative Party from 1955 onwards declined so heavily, you don't have a party in Scotland which is outright absolutely capitalist, if you like, that is electable in the way that you do in the rest of the UK. The Conservative Party simply are not electable in Scotland as a legacy of Thatcherism, and so on and so on, but it's simply the case. That's not to say there aren't strong business elements in Scotland, that there aren't capitalists and so on. And the strange thing is that you have them represented in both the SNP and the Labour Party and so on. A lot of people make a sort of big thing out of the left-right split in the SNP. It does exist, it's not like it's constantly warring, but my point is this: both Labour and the SNP, to some level or other, attempt to occupy a space on the centre-left. They both have pro-business elements within it, they both have left elements within it, and there's obviously a space to the right of them and to the left of them which currently isn't being filled. So in the event of a yes vote, you can see these unstable alliances potentially breaking away. In my opinion, what you need is the establishment of some sort of left party. RIC can maybe play some sort of role in facilitating this. I'm not saying RIC could become a new party. I think RIC needs to stay as a movement as it is, which is all-encompassing, a coalition and all that sort of thing. But we are beginning to talk about, and these debates are now beginning to happen, about the possibility of launching some sort of new left party which provides an infrastructure for all the people who've got involved for the first time and so on, and which, as you say, can challenge. It's always a possibility that Trident, that Salmond could try and do a deal over Trident. Obviously, we heard in The Guardian a senior source in the Conservative saying, they want the pound, we want Trident, we can do some sort of deal. Sorry, I'll finish in 2 seconds. But we need some sort of left to be able to challenge that, and so we are beginning to have that sort of debate, and I think that could happen in the event of a yes vote. That would be my loose answer for a general strategy after September 18th.
Sorry, Pete.
Just to answer a couple of sort of points that got raised. When one around the activity in Scotland, it has been amazing. I mean, I've been involved in left-wing campaigns for a while, and it's often the thing where you go and campaign in an area and it sort of stops there, if you like. Basically, the Radical Independence campaigns attempted to target certain working class areas, communities and so on, and generally we've had mass canvases of like 100, 150 people in the most deprived areas, Easterhouse and all these sorts of places that people have spoken about. And we'll attempt to build meetings afterwards, and actually for once it always seems to work. You go on a public meeting, loads of people come, and they actually organise, and that's how we've built most of our groups, and so the groups are genuinely run by people we've met when we've gone out, and they say, well, I want to get involved in this and so on, and so we've left that behind. And it's been remarkable. As I say, we've done this sort of thing before and it's not worked. In this context, suddenly it starts to work. On the question of I think that people have already responded, in the audience have already discussed very effectively why you guys should support Scottish independence. But one person raised an interesting question, which is a lot of the discussion seems tactical about the left advancing a little bit more, some left ideas going a little bit further forward. And I think there is a very good reason for this, which is that when you get beyond the fact that independence could break up the British state, which is, in my opinion, definitely a good thing, when you go beyond that, you get to a point which is that for the first time in quite a while, the left's actually got influence at a national level, on a societal level. And that's not something in Scotland, on the left, that we've been used to for quite a long time. Now, we've managed to pull the debate, genuinely, I think, to the left, in a lot of ways. So, for example, we set up the Radical Independence Conference. People involved in it, in the Jimmy Reid Foundation, started to set up the Common Weal campaign and so on. The Common Weal is basically a sort of lefty think tank that puts forward policy ideas for an independent Scotland, which are loosely based around a sort of left of Scandinavia type thing. And I'm not saying Scandinavia is perfect, but it's fundamentally influenced the debate. So you have the official Yes Scotland campaign saying, we basically support the Common Weal's initiative.
You've got the SNP now, which has a pro-business wing, but at its last conference embraced the Commonweal Manifesto and the policies involved in it. Now, I'm not saying they're not going to backslide. Of course they are, in certain ways, and I think the point about the reorganisation of the right is absolutely fundamental, because I'm not going to lie, there are people who have got involved in the Yes movement from the business wing saying the Tories are a terrible brand, we as the business class need representation, capitalists need representation, let's ditch the Tory brand. Actually, under independence we could have something else, something different. They're not a big force in the independence movement at the moment, but that is something that's definitely going to happen. But the reason that we have such big tactical debates is, I suppose, because everything's in flux. There are no precedents at the moment about what's going to happen after the event of a vote. And for once, the left seems like it is actually going to continue to be a serious force. The reason that the debate has emerged around launching a new broad left party is simply because in all the meetings we have and so on, people say they want it. We've been forced to take it seriously because when we talk about what when people ask us what are you going to do after September 18th, generally they're the ones that say we need something to the left of the SNP, to the left of Labour, that people like us can get involved in. So we have to take that seriously. That's why we're attempting to now bring this up as a debate about how we move forward and so on. And just one final point on this, because again, why I think we could have a serious impact. So at the SNP conference a couple of years ago now, they voted to support an independent Scotland joining the NATO nuclear alliance. Now, as a result, several thousand members of the SNP left. A couple of about a good, just under 100 councillors left, 2 members of the Scottish Parliament left, all over this principal decision, as it were. Now, some of them have stayed active, most of them have just drifted away. If you had a serious left force, if you had a left parliamentary force, you could genuinely see at least a section of those people joining it. The point is this, that the way in which the parties are currently constituted is unstable. They attempt to represent both elements of business and of this sort of centre-left Scandinavian model type thing. How can we attempt to force a fissure into that and bring people onto our side? As I say, in the example of NATO, if we had a left party that still had 6 MSPs in Parliament, I think that not only would a lot of those people who left have joined it, I think that a lot more people could have potentially left. And I think in the event as well of, even in the event of a no vote or a yes vote, what are the Labour Party going to do? There's going to have to be serious debates inside the Labour Party about what direction articles that you can write. All of it is incredibly useful. So thank you so much for all coming, and I do hope that you go away and do even one tiny little thing to support this cause. Thank you.